Wyoming Territory, June of 1883. The wind was hard and the gossip harder when Naomi Tilson stood in a dusty churchyard. Chin raised, dress borrowed, hands shaking, and said she was a bride. Laughter cracked through the small crowd like firewood snapping in a flame. A bride! Someone snorted. To who? The wind. She found that dress in the charity barrel behind the general store. Another voice called. Naomi's cheeks burned, but she did not lower her head. She stood tall, clutching the bouquet of prairie wildflowers she had picked herself before sunrise. Her boots were scuffed, her hair loose from its pins. She had not eaten since yesterday, but she would not leave. She had said it plain. I am a bride. The laughter stung, but not more than the years behind her. Not more than the hunger, the loss, or the ache of trying to keep her two younger siblings alive alone. Not more than watching her parents buried before her 10th birthday. Not more than the man who promised her marriage and then rode off with their money, leaving her stranded in this town with nothing but a name that nobody bothered to use. She looked down at her brother and sister Nella, 8, and Nathan, 5, standing just behind her, holding hands. Their faces were thin, their eyes wide. She stood for them. If she was not a bride, then she was nothing. That was when the cowboy spoke. He stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, dusty from the trail, broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered hat pulled down low. He had not been there when she arrived. She had not seen him in 5 years. Not since he left the broken-down ranch her father once ran. Not since he was a boy with sharp eyes and quiet hands. Seth Dallin. He took off his hat and looked her in the eyes. She is the only one I will marry. The laughter died. Naomi's lips parted, her breath catching. Seth. He nodded once. I came back for you. Someone muttered. That cannot be right. But Seth did not flinch. He turned toward the preacher, who still held the worn Bible in his hands, uncertain. You still willing to perform a wedding, Reverend? The preacher blinked, then gave a shaky nod. Seth stepped beside Naomi, took her hand gently in his. His grip was warm, steady. Her fingers trembled in his. You do not have to, she whispered. I do, he said. You were always the one. The preacher began the words. Naomi barely heard them. Her chest felt tight like it might split open. She had not cried in 2 years. Not since the night Nathan burned with fever and nearly died. But now tears welled. Seth looked down at her and smiled, slow and sure. You still like lilacs? She nodded. They were Mama's favorite. I planted a few behind my cabin. Figured you might come see them someday. The preacher asked the question. I do, Seth said. Naomi swallowed hard. I do. Their first kiss was soft and careful, like a promise. The crowd did not clap. Nobody cheered. But her brother tugged her skirt and said, Does this mean we can go home now? Seth crouched down and looked Nathan in the eye. You hungry? Nathan nodded fast. Well, let us go fix that. Seth took Naomi's hand again, and they walked away from the church. The crowd parted slowly, confused and quiet. Back at his cabin, built solid against the foothills west of town, Seth cooked beans and cornbread while Naomi sat at the table with the children. He moved through the kitchen like he remembered the way she liked her eggs, like he had been waiting for this. She watched him in silence, her heart pounding. Later, when the children were asleep on a blanket by the fire, she stepped out onto the porch. The wind was softer here. The stars were out. Seth joined her, standing close but not touching. You all right? She nodded. I do not know what you just did back there. He looked out into the dark. I meant every word. I thought you left. I did. I was 17. I had nothing to offer you. You have a cabin now. I have more than that. He turned to her. I have a reason. Naomi stared at him. Why me? He smiled again, this time not careful. Because I have loved you since we were kids. Because I saw you holding your brother's hand and standing in front of that church like you had a whole army behind you. Because you never once asked for help, even when you should have. I did not think anyone would come. I came. She shook her head, stunned. Seth, I don't know how to be a wife. I don't know how to. I am not asking you to be anything except here. With me. Her throat closed. I cannot pay you back. Naomi, he said, and his voice was low, steady. I did not marry you to be paid back. I married you because it was always going to be you. She stepped closer, drawn like a flame to warmth. I still have nothing. You have me. She looked up at him, saw the truth in his eyes. Her hand reached for his without thinking. He caught it, held it to his chest. You are not alone anymore, he whispered. Naomi leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe she might be safe. She might be loved. She might be home. The next morning broke slow and gold, light spilling across the wooden floorboards of Seth's cabin like it had nowhere better to be. Naomi stood barefoot at the stove, sleeves rolled up, stirring cornmeal into a pot. The scent of chicory coffee drifted behind her, and outside, birds called from the cottonwoods. Seth stepped in from the lean-to, his shirt damp at the collar, hair still wet from the pump. He paused when he saw her, but said nothing. Just crossed to the table where Nella was drawing shapes in the flour dust and Nathan was chewing on a heel of bread. Firewood stacked, he said, reaching for a tin cup. I set snares by the ridge. Might bring in rabbit if the weather holds. Naomi stirred once more and set the spoon aside. You always did work before most folks are up. I don't sleep much. She nodded, not asking why. I was going to mend the children's clothes today. Nella's dress is coming apart at the hem. She can use some of the fabric from that old feed sack in the loft. Blue check. Naomi glanced at him. You remembered that? You liked it. Said it looked like the sky after a storm. Nathan spilled his cup. Naomi moved quick to mop it up with the corner of her apron. Seth crouched, steadying the boy with one hand on his back. Nathan didn't flinch. Naomi watched the two of them. He don't usually take to men. I ain't most men. She didn't argue. Later, while the children napped curled up like pups on the braided rug, Naomi stood at the edge of the small pasture behind the cabin. The grass grew in uneven patches, and the fence leaned like it might give up if the wind pressed too hard. 2 horses grazed on the far side, one chestnut, one gray. Seth stood beside her, arms folded, watching. That gray yours? She asked. Found her limping near the canyon edge last winter. Took me 3 days to get her to stand still long enough for a halter. She's still favoring her right leg. I see it. She's stubborn, though. Won't give in easy. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself. That kind of fight usually costs something. Seth glanced her way. You know that better than most. She nodded, quiet. He shifted, his voice lower. I've been thinking there's land past the ridge nobody's worked in years. The soil's not bad. We could plant potatoes, maybe barley. I meant what I said, Naomi. I didn't marry you to put you in a corner. This is your place now, same as mine. I don't know anything about planting. He smiled, just enough to crinkle the skin beside his eyes. Neither did I when I started. I'd need a needle and thread before I ever touched a plow. He looked at her hands, rough from years of scrubbing, chopping, sewing. You've done more with less. She turned back to the field. They won't take kindly to it. To what? To me. You. This. I didn't marry them. She swallowed hard. They'll say I tricked you. You didn't. They'll say I brought nothing with me. You brought yourself. That's more than anyone could ask. Naomi stared at the broken line of trees across the pasture. The sky was wide above them, pale blue and open. You really think we could grow something out there? I think we already are, he said. She looked at him then, really looked. There were lines around his mouth she hadn't noticed before. A scar near his left ear, faint but there. He had changed, but not in the ways that mattered. I might try, she said. That's all I'd ask. She didn't reach for his hand, but she stepped closer, and that was enough. That evening, while Seth carved a new handle for the well bucket, Naomi sat on the porch mending Nella's dress with the blue check fabric. The cool air curled around her sleeves, and from inside came the soft sound of the children breathing deep in sleep. She didn't feel like a bride, not in any way she'd ever imagined. But she felt something else, something like a beginning. Not loud, not grand, just steady. When Seth came to sit beside her, she didn't speak. Neither did he. They watched the stars rise without needing to fill the silence. The following days settled into a rhythm Naomi hadn't known she'd missed. Mornings began with bread warmed over embers and the children's bare feet padding along the floor. Seth rose early, but never without leaving water on the stove and kindling by the hearth. Naomi learned quickly the way his boots sounded on the porch, the way his silence wasn't distance, just ease. By the fourth morning, she took a basket down to the creek below the cottonwoods. Nella skipping ahead with a tin pail, Nathan trailing behind, wary of the dark water. The creek ran low this time of year, but clear. Naomi knelt on the flat rocks, sleeves rolled, and began scrubbing his shirt with lye soap and a stone. You got a husband now, came a voice behind her. Ought not be kneeling in the mud like a washer girl. Naomi stood and turned, the wind lifting loose strands of her hair. The woman wore gloves too fine for the weather and a traveling bonnet tied too tight under her chin. Mrs. Delancey, widow of the bank's late partner. She held herself like she owned the land she walked on. Naomi didn't answer. She wrung out the shirt and laid it across a sun-warmed boulder. How long d'you think he'll keep you? Mrs. Delancey asked, eyes narrowing. Men like him get restless. They don't stay tied to girls who come with nothing. Nella watched the woman with a frown, her hand tightening on the pail. Nathan crouched close to Naomi, quiet. I don't answer to you, Naomi said, voice cool. You do when your name's on a paper I control. That cabin sits near the eastern section line. It's not claimed formal. Naomi didn't blink. We'll claim it. With what? You haven't even got shoes for that child. Naomi picked up the basket, turned to the children. We're done here. You'll come running when it falls apart, Mrs. Delancey called after her. You won't like how it feels when the land's taken out from under you. Back at the cabin, Naomi hung the shirt on a line stretched between posts. Seth was driving fence posts by the far pasture, sleeves rolled, hat low. She didn't go to him. Not yet. Instead, she sat on the porch step and pulled Nella onto her lap, brushing dirt from the child's knees. You all right? She asked. Nella nodded, pressing her cheek against Naomi's shoulder. That evening, Naomi found Seth oiling the hinges on the barn door. She waited until he set the tin aside. She came to the creek, Naomi said. Mrs. Delancey said the land wasn't ours. Seth wiped his hands on a rag. She's right. It's not filed. And if she files first, she won't. That land's been ignored for years. Nobody wants it but me. Naomi leaned against the stall post. We should make it ours proper. I was planning to ride to the clerk's office next week. I want to go with you. He looked at her, brow creased. You sure? She met his eyes. I want to put my name on something that lasts. He nodded once. All right. She hesitated, then said, She said you'd leave. I won't. People say things. People don't know me. Naomi looked down at her hands. She's right about one thing. We don't have much. Seth stepped closer. We've got enough. Naomi's voice dropped low. I never had a place that stayed mine. You do now. She looked up at him, then, and something in her face softened, just a little. I'd like to plant something by the porch. What kind? She thought for a moment. Whatever grows deep. He touched her elbow, brief but steady. We'll dig together. That night, after the children had gone quiet, Naomi brought out a folded scrap of paper from an old biscuit tin. She spread it on the table and smoothed the creases. It was a drawing rough, but careful of a house with 2 chimneys, a fence and rows of vegetables. Seth leaned over her shoulder. You draw this? She nodded. Years ago. I kept it in my apron when we moved around. He studied it. Looks like it needs a bench on the porch. She glanced up. You think we could build it? We'll start with the bench. Naomi folded the paper slowly. I want the children to grow up with roots under them. They will. She looked at him for a long breath, then reached across the table and took his hand. He didn't move, just let her hold it. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something to go wrong. She felt like they'd begun. The trail to the land office in Laramie was dry and rutted, the kind of journey that left a body sore down to the bone. Naomi rode behind Seth on his older gelding, a placid sorrel with a slow gait and a stubborn streak. She held tight to the small satchel tucked at her side inside, a folded page bearing her mother's name written in an old, careful hand. It wasn't proof of anything legal, but it was all she had of where she'd come from. They reached town near midday, the sun high and sharp. Seth helped her down, his hands steady at her waist, and she let it linger longer than she might have dared a week ago. He didn't say anything, just nodded toward the stone building at the far end of the street. They walked in together. The clerk behind the desk glanced up, more interested in his inkpot than the couple before him. Claim filing. Seth nodded. Eastern Ridge, west of Bitter Creek. The clerk pulled a ledger over, licking a finger to flip through pages. That's Delancey property. No, Naomi said, stepping forward. She's never filed it. We checked with the county records. The clerk squinted at her. You the bride. She didn't hesitate. I'm Naomi Dallin. His expression didn't change, but his pen scratched across the page. You got the $2? Seth reached into his coat. Naomi stopped him and pulled the coins from her satchel. They clinked on the desk, dull from age. The man counted them, then stamped the ledger. Land's yours, long as you work it. We will, Naomi said. Outside, the wind pressed sharp against her skirt. She stood still on the boardwalk, staring down at the rough paper with her name beside Seth's. Her thumb traced the edge. You all right? He asked. I didn't think I'd feel anything, she said quietly. But I do. Seth didn't press her. He just rested a hand against the small of her back, gentle and grounding. On the ride home, they stopped once at a narrow bluff where the land dropped away into low, green valleys. Naomi slid from the saddle and stood at the edge, watching the sky stretch wide, her bonnet strings loose around her neck. Seth came up beside her, arms folded, gazing out. That stream down there feeds into the creek. Could divert some of it if we build a trench. Naomi crouched, brushing her fingers through the coarse grass. We could grow squash here, maybe carrots. Long growing season, but it'll work. She stood again, brushing dust from her apron. I want to build a shed before winter, for curing root vegetables and drying herbs. Seth turned to her, his face unreadable for a moment, then softened. You think in seasons. I had to. When you don't have much, you plan for the cold first. He nodded. We'll get shingles from town. I've got scrap wood behind the barn. They rode the rest of the way in near silence, but the kind that held ease, not distance. That night, Naomi sat by the fire stitching new sleeves onto Nathan's shirt from the worn hem of her own. Seth was outside, nailing a brace onto the porch rail. She could hear the slow rhythm of the hammer, the pause between strikes. Nella lay curled near the hearth, one hand tucked under her chin. When the door creaked open, Naomi looked up. Seth stepped in, setting his hat on the peg. He crossed to the table and poured water from the pitcher, drinking deep. She set her needle aside. "Did you always know how to fix things?" "No," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Just knew I'd have to." She tilted her head. "What made you come back?" He didn't answer right away. The fire crackled. The wind shifted outside. "You remember that spring your father took us up to the high meadow?" he asked. Naomi nodded slowly. "He brought salt and pepper for the snow onions. Said they tasted better that way. You fell in the stream. Your dress froze stiff before we got you back down. I couldn't feel my toes for a week." Seth leaned against the wall. "I remember thinking, if I ever had a place of my own, I'd plant snow onions near the house, so you could pick them without falling in." Naomi watched him, her throat tight. He stepped closer. "I didn't know if you'd still be here, but I hoped." She rose, quiet, her fingers smoothing the front of her skirt. "I'm not the same girl. I'm not the same boy." She took a step toward him. "I don't know how to be soft after everything." "I don't need soft," he said. "I just need true." Naomi reached for his hand. He let her take it, their fingers threading without force. "We're planting snow onions in the spring," she said. His voice was low. "I'll dig the trench." She looked up at him, and the space between them closed like it had only been waiting for the right moment. When he kissed her, it wasn't hesitant or cautious. It was whole, quiet, and sure. Outside, the wind dropped low, brushing the eaves like a hush. Inside, the fire burned steady. The first frost came early that year, silvering the field edges and curling the last of the squash leaves before Naomi could gather them all in. She moved quick through the morning, wrapping the children in shawls and checking the root cellar twice to be sure the canning jars hadn't cracked. Seth split firewood until his shoulders ached, steam rising off his back in the cold air. The porch railing held the last of the drying herbs, stiff with cold but still fragrant when brushed by passing sleeves. Inside, Naomi hung a wool blanket across the doorframe to keep the draft out and stitched quilt blocks in the late afternoon light. She worked in quiet rhythm, her needle steady, her thoughts drifting toward spring and all the things they might plant if the frost didn't bite so deep the soil stayed hard. Seth had traded for a sack of barley seed, stored now in the loft wrapped in oiled cloth to keep the mice out. She'd found an old tin box in the barn and began keeping notes: what grew, what didn't, how long each row held before the weeds overtook it. It was a small thing, but it felt like claiming something with her own hands. One evening, after Nathan had fallen asleep curled against the dog and Nella was bent over her slate, copying letters by lamplight, Naomi stepped out to the barn where Seth was hanging the new harness he'd mended. She leaned against the stall, arms crossed, watching him loop the leather with practiced ease. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low to keep from waking the stock. Seth turned only halfway, waiting. "I want to teach the children more than letters and chores. Nella asks questions I don't always know how to answer." He set the harness down. "Like what? Why the stars don't fall. Why the snow waits on the mountain but not in the valley. She's got a sharp mind. She gets it from you." Naomi shook her head. "I had to teach myself what I could, out of scraps and second-hand books. I want better for her." Seth stepped closer, wiping his hands on a cloth. "There's an old schoolhouse east of the canyon. Roof's near gone, but the walls are sound. I could fix it up." She looked up at him, a faint crease between her brows. "You'd do that? I'd do anything that makes you look at me the way you're looking now." He said it without jest, without needing anything in return. Naomi felt something shift deep in her ribs, something that hadn't moved since before her mother's hands went still. "I'd teach every child within walking distance," she said. "There's more like us scattered. They just need somewhere to gather. Then we'll make that place." She stepped into him, resting her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, not tight, just sure, the way he always did when he meant to say something without words. Snow fell that night, soft and slow, covering the pasture in a thin white hush. Naomi stood at the window before dawn, the children still asleep, and watched the sky grow pale. Seth came behind her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "I've never watched a winter come in without fear," she said. "You don't have to now." She leaned back against him. "I believe you." Weeks passed. The children helped as they could. Nella learned to feed the stove. Nathan toted kindling with both arms. Naomi began teaching them from the Bible first, then from the old primer Seth had found in a trade bundle. She wrote words on scraps of paper and let them sound them out by firelight. The cabin filled with quiet learning, the kind that deepened instead of echoing. By mid-December, Seth had cleared the schoolhouse yard and replaced most of the roof slats with salvaged boards. Naomi swept the floor, hung a curtain across the broken pane, and brought in a wooden crate for storing the books they'd gathered. The room smelled of pine pitch and dust, and Naomi loved it. On the first day of lessons, 5 children showed up, boots muddy, cheeks red from wind. Their mothers came too, standing shy in the doorway until Naomi invited them in with tea boiled over the iron stove. By the end of that week, there were 9 students and a small wooden sign out front that read, in careful lettering, "Ridge School." That night, Naomi placed her hand over Seth's as they sat on the porch, wrapped in one blanket. "I didn't know it could feel like this," she said. "Like what?" "Like I belong." Seth turned his hand to catch hers. "You belonged the first day you stood in that churchyard." She rested her head against his shoulder. "I didn't know it then. You do now." She closed her eyes, listening to the wind move through the bare trees. For once, it didn't sound like loss. It sounded like home. On Christmas morning, Nella and Nathan ran into the bedroom carrying 2 small bundles wrapped in muslin. Seth opened his to find a hand-stitched glove with his initials sewn near the wrist. Naomi's was a ribbon, dyed with walnut husk, and a folded note from Nella that read, "Teacher and Mama." Seth lifted Naomi's hand and kissed the top of it. "They know what you are." She smiled at him, tears unshed but shining. "So do you." That spring, they planted rows of barley, carrots, snow onions, and beans. Naomi marked each row with a stake and a name. Children came from farther, some riding on wagons, others walking miles. The schoolhouse grew louder, warmer, worn in the way things are when they're loved. Seth finished building a bench for the porch, long enough for 4. He carved their names into the back rail. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields shimmered gold, Naomi stepped outside to find Seth hammering the last nail into a wooden sign above their door. She read it aloud, voice steady. "The Dallin place." He turned to her. "It's yours as much as mine." She walked to him and cupped his face in her hands. "It always was." When they kissed, it was slow and certain, the kind that needed no words after. They grew old on that land, side by side. The schoolhouse stood through wind and rain, rebuilt and repainted as needed. The children learned, grew, left, and returned. Naomi's garden stayed full. Seth's hands remained steady. Their days were quiet, rich in work and warmth. And every spring the snow onions bloomed.